It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the Changing Tastes team. So today we are welcoming Chef R.J. Harvey, culinary strategist at Changing Tastes. Chef R.J. Harvey is a culinary strategist at Changing Tastes, bringing expertise in culinary nutrition, recipe, and product development. RJ has honed his craft in some of the best kitchens in the country and uses his firm grasp of global flavors, plant-forward ingredients, and modern technique to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. A proud graduate with honors from Johnson & Wales University, he believes in sustainable, seasonal, produce-driven menus that are alive with flavor and nutrition. Taking a food is the best medicine approach to cooking. Every ingredient is looked upon not only for flavor, texture, and aroma, but also for nutritional function. With Changing Tastes, RJ's efforts aid in linking sustainability, solid nutrition, and culinary excellence to help promote personal and global wellness through the foods we consume and the communities we live in. We are also pleased to be joined today by Penelope Schur-Wasserman, managing consultant at Changing Tastes, where she creates campaigns and strategies to promote social and ecological restoration using food as her medium, as well as integrating multi-sensory awareness and physical alignment to in-person decision-making, training, and other experiences. She also oversees Changing Tastes brand strategy and design. Penelope's work on aligning consumer understanding and market recognition for fair treatment of workers, as well as for regenerative agriculture and aquaculture, has been integrated into a host of social marketing efforts, as well as her presentation at the Blue Economy Plenary of the Business of Conservation Conference of the African Leadership Institute in Rwanda in 2019. And finally, pleased to introduce to you Arlen Wasserman, founder and managing director at Changing Tastes. Over the past 2 decades, Arlen has helped identify and catalyze some of the most significant shifts in the way business and consumers think about food. Wasserman's accomplishments include working with General Mills to develop the first sustainability strategy for a major US food company and creating strategy to drive growth in the once nascent US organic food industry. He accomplished this by linking organic farming and personal health, including raising awareness of antibiotic use in dairy and livestock production, and developing the plant-forward culinary strategy, which is now a major focus of culinary innovation in the Western world. This strategy also continues to contribute to a meaningful reduction in the environmental footprint of the hospitality industry. So that's the team. Arlen, Penelope, RJ, a warm welcome from us. Thank you so much for being here. Penelope, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Conservation Alliance, and for everybody who's joining us on the Zoom today. We are really excited to share the More If by Sea messaging platform for you. So welcome to our session and the keys to getting Americans to shift their appetites to eat more sustainably harvested foods from our oceans. Changing Tastes is pleased to be able to share our latest work on messaging to change what Americans eat. And for the past 20 years, Changing Tastes has worked to achieve better environmental, health, and business outcomes by doing just that, changing what Americans eat, with a specific focus on improving the choices businesses make about what to offer us. Some of the now common changes in what we eat, from our preferences for organic foods to antibiotic-free chicken, and the growing interest in plant-forward meals, are all the results of our work. Over the past few years, we've turned our attention increasingly to the ocean, and have had the chance to spend more time with the Alliance and organizations like yours. And our time today is so very important. So you and your organizations are among the most influential in how Americans eat and think about fish and seafood. You have had a remarkable impact, and the issues and the way you communicate continue to shape the attitudes Americans have about eating fish and seafood and the market for sustainable seafood overall. So wouldn't it be great if sustainable fish and seafood made up a larger share of the American diet? That's where we're focused today. Why get more of our food from the oceans? Because we all know it will benefit our health, our planet, and also grow the market for sustainable seafood. With that in mind, Changing Tastes, with the support of Builder's Vision, took on the challenge of developing a new way to message or talk about fish and seafood to dramatically increase the consumption in the United States. We set an ambitious goal to increase the per capita seafood consumption in the United States by 80% within 5 years, which would be by far the largest increase in many decades. Eating fish and seafood instead of other foods, not in addition to everything else. So by this, we mean getting people to switch to eat a larger share of our diet from the ocean, not just eat more fish and seafood on top of everything else, which would provide no environmental benefits whatsoever. And also, given the rate of overweight and obesity in the United States, would not deliver health benefits either. We don't want to make people more fat. So getting people who already eat fish and seafood occasionally to choose fish and seafood more often instead of other choices. And we thought about how we got there. The best health advice is to eat fish and seafood twice a week. And just under 1 out of every 5 American adults do that already. I'm sure we all know someone who just doesn't like fish and doesn't eat fish or seafood. Maybe they're a vegan, maybe they're a vegetarian, or like I said, maybe they just hate fish, and they're unlikely to change their mind. So this isn't who we are talking about. But there's a much larger group, most American adults, who do eat fish and seafood, but only occasionally. Getting them to eat more is the key to driving a meaningful increase. So for the next hour of your life, we will discuss the demographics, consumption, and menu trends. We'll look at a few of the headlines from market research we've been conducting, both about what we eat and the attitudes and intentions of consumers, and also key buyers or purchasing and menu decision makers. Then we'll look at the messages that we can all use when we speak with businesses like grocery retailers and restaurant food service companies, and with the general public that will help us achieve this ambitious goal. Before we move on, the background for all of us is that the market is in a time of transition, in no small part due to COVID. It has scrambled the marketplace for consumers and businesses, disrupted and maybe changed where we eat and what our choices are, and revealed a lot about how health advice and science influences our choices. And with that, Arlen, over to you.
Thanks. And I get to talk about consumption, or what we eat. And we think about changing what we eat. We should be incredibly optimistic about our ability to make this significant change in increasing fish and seafood consumption by 80% and having it replace other food choices. We're in the midst of a once in a generation, or really two, change in what Americans eat, particularly proteins. Just a couple months ago, we found that only half of Americans now consider themselves regular meat eaters. During COVID, 1 out of 11 American adults decided they were going to change and stop eating red meat regularly, which is the biggest change we've seen in the decade that we've been tracking this. Now, the #1 choice for Americans who want to eat less red meat is to replace it with fish and seafood. That intention to eat less red meat has been longstanding and resulted in a real difference. We've seen red meat decrease by 13% per capita by 13% over the past 2 decades. This change since 2005 actually represents 15% of the national carbon reduction goal that President Biden committed to at Glasgow. But what's been going on is that instead of red meat, we've been eating more chicken instead, not fish and seafood so far. Fish and shellfish consumption remain less than 20% of chicken consumption, and fall below any other protein except turkey and beans. So as Penelope said, how do we get this to change? And who is our target consumer? We don't start with everyone. The target is to get people who already eat fish and seafood occasionally to eat it more often instead of something else. We look at the American fish and seafood eater. As Penelope mentioned, 70% of American adults, or just under 1 in 5, already eat fish and seafood twice a week, which is the best health advice from the dietary guidelines. Another 1 in 10 eat it weekly, and about half eat it just once or twice a month. Then there's another third who eat it occasionally, less than monthly, and 14% who will never eat fish and seafood, which includes the vegetarians and vegans in the United States, as well as people who just really don't like fish. We call these people who eat fish and seafood between once a week and once or twice a month occasional eaters. And if we get them, and of these occasional eaters, they're a little different than the twice a weekers in that they eat at least half their meals, and for those who eat it once a month, almost all their meals containing fish and seafood in restaurants. Getting occasional eaters to eat fish and seafood just one more time each week would increase consumption frequency, or the number of meals Americans eat each week containing fish and seafood, by 89%, and probably drive up consumption by nearly as much. Those occasional eaters, those motivated and positioned to eat more, also value food integrity issues, reducing the environmental impact of their food choices, including animal welfare, and seeking out a diversity of food choices as all important. They're also more likely to eat their fish and seafood out and are much less likely to cook it themselves. They're actually more likely to bring in ready-to-eat fish and seafood than others. And with that look at consumption, I'm going to turn it over to RJ to talk about fish on the menu and on the plate.
Well, thank you very much, Arlen. As we look at fish and menu on the plate, it's really important to understand where Americans are consuming their fish and seafood at. As Arlen mentioned, most of that has been traditionally in restaurants. However, COVID definitely interrupted that trend a little bit. For nearly the last 2 decades, we've seen Americans enjoying meals more and more at restaurants or food away from home, as you can see on this chart here. With that, they've also increased the share of seafood meals that they've eaten away from home, and those meals have been prepared by others, obviously chefs, restaurants, etc. Now, restaurants have served a large, and grocery store shelves have been selling a larger amount, with more Americans choosing to eat at home as opposed to dining in at those restaurants. Now, restaurants have introduced traditionally more new kinds of fish and seafood to Americans, showcasing different preparations and getting Americans excited about different types of fish and seafood. However, that really hasn't changed their drive to enjoy fish and seafood at home. With COVID, however, we did notice that a lot of Americans stocked up on canned fish and seafood. So most of these Americans had to enjoy their fish and seafood at home, and or carry out, takeout, delivery. Those were other options. In particular, we noticed that not only were Americans buying more fish and seafood canned fish and seafood at home to stock up on, we also noticed that younger generations were enjoying carry out and takeout. So if you go back and look at this chart, what we notice is that not only were they substantially reducing the amount that they were eating at restaurants, but also they did return to restaurants pretty heavily within the last year. You can see those two lines are converging again, and we're noticing an uptick in dining at restaurants. So this presents a unique opportunity for restaurants to showcase new and exciting ways to enjoy fish and seafood away from home. One of the things to note is that most of the reporting of fish and seafood eaten away from home are really in the favor of salmon, particularly farm salmon, as well as shrimp over other choices. And you can see this is outlined here by 3 options of different types of poke bowls, whether it's salmon, shrimp, or even tuna. With menu trends, most Americans have been enjoying the types of fish and seafood that they can't prepare at home, along with other types of foods, so typically global cuisine. In particular, younger generations of Americans, millennials and Generation Z, are buying a lot of sushi to enjoy at home through takeout and carry-out restaurants and through third-party delivery apps. This has helped also cut back on some of the canned and seafood purchases that we've seen at retail over the last 2 years due to COVID. What we also noticed is that there was a reduction in full service dining in certain regions as certain temperatures dropped over the winter time and transmission rates rose. However, we are starting to see more Americans interested in going back to restaurants. So hopefully we will start to see chefs have more influence on the types of foods that Americans are consuming, particularly fish and seafood. So I want to take a look for a second at menu penetration for all US restaurants, right? If we look at this graph here, you'll notice that fish and seafood in particular are fairly well penetrated, but not as much so as other types of animal proteins. When we look at red meat, for example, or poultry, you'll notice that those are starting to decline. However, you are also starting to see that shellfish is pretty well penetrated, as is fish, but just definitely not as much as poultry is. So there's a unique growth opportunity when we look at the types of menu items that are on American menus across the country. This is a unique chart, and one thing to note is the types of fish and seafood that are increasing on American menus. What's fascinating is for the last couple of decades, we've noticed that, or for the last 10 years or so, we've noticed that shrimp, salmon, and tuna have pretty much been in the top 3. Tuna has dropped a little bit off of where it was previous underneath salmon. But one thing to note are more interesting types of fish and seafood that are growing in popularity on American menus. We've got things such as ahi tuna or even octopus growing, in addition to some of these other more unique types of fish and seafood that food service operators are starting to menu more as they grow acceptance within the American market. So outside of some of the analog plant-based burgers and some of the vegetarian staples, such as things like falafel, you'll notice that above all other types of animal proteins, fish and seafood really do have the highest projected growth over the next 4 years. In particular, looking at items such as trout, octopus, and oysters, with some pretty predominant menu growth, in addition to salmon, crab, and sea bass. And I think with that, Arlen's going to talk a little bit about what is important to consumers when it comes to enjoying fish and seafood.
Thanks, RJ. And that's a really great segue. So we have this great potential for restaurants to serve more. The trends are in the right direction, but COVID sent them in the opposite direction, taking fish and seafood off the menu. We think about things like perishability or the challenge in getting people with skill to cook in the kitchen. These are all reasons that fish and seafood have been taken away over the short term. But that's on the side of what our restaurants and grocery retailers offering us. I want to take a minute now to look at what's changing with the consumers, which is also very significant. When we began this project, we did not expect it, but we found that in the past year, America has undergone a generational change. For several decades, and really the life of the sustainable seafood movement, baby boomers have been the largest generation in America by number and also by purchasing power. And in the past year, they ceded that role to millennials, who are now the largest generation by number, and along with Gen Zers, the largest by purchasing dollars. And without focusing on it too heavily, this is actually due in part to COVID, which caused many baby boomers to retire early and spend less. And then through the end of last year, 8 out of every 10 deaths due to COVID were baby boomers. So the decline in that generation, which was expected at some point in future years, has been accelerated by COVID. And we now have this generational change as to which generations are dominating the marketplace. Within that, with the research we did into consumer attitudes and behaviors in April and again in November and December to see how COVID was shaping them, we found a few things that changed, but a lot of things that didn't. Americans, by and large, more than 9 out of 10, still shop for fish and seafood one meal at a time. What that means is for each trip to the grocery store, they eat fish and seafood at home no more than once. And with COVID reducing our frequency of grocery shopping, this is a significant factor. We still eat fish and seafood less frequently than beef, pork, and chicken. And we eat it more often than most plant-based foods. One thing that changed during COVID is Americans are now much less willing to eat plant-based meat replacements and are more interested in fish and seafood. Overall, more consumers want to eat more fish and seafood. 1 out of 3 say they intend to eat more next year compared to any other protein choice they can make. The motivation for eating fish and seafood is varied. And this chart, and we'll share the presentation so you can examine it later, looks at a host of reasons why people say they might choose fish and seafood compared to other protein choices. And baby boomers are still more likely to replace meat with fish and seafood in order to have a healthy heart, 3 out of 4, and eat healthy fats, almost 7 out of 10. But Gen Zs and millennials are motivated to switch to fish and seafood for other reasons, including reducing the environmental impact of their food choices, to provide superior animal welfare, and also because they're concerned about eating antibiotics or other chemicals. There's also a variety of factors like avoiding antibiotics and chemicals, reducing the environmental impact of food choices, and animal welfare that are much more important to those people who eat fish and seafood about once a month than people who eat fish and seafood twice a week. When we look across all the protein choices, consumer concerns about meat and poultry are well established. For the past 7 years, the factors that influence consumers about whether they're going to eat either meat or poultry or other choices include antibiotic use, humane treatment or animal welfare, the use of pesticides, fertilizers, and other chemicals, and price. And those have remained stable for the last 7 years, with value or price occasionally rising to third instead of fourth. But fish and seafood is in flux. And right now, the single biggest consideration when Americans say, am I going to eat more fish and seafood, is whether they're going to ingest plastic contamination or microplastics, followed by price, rising concern about antibiotic use, and industrial pollution. And antibiotic use is sufficient because when we surveyed consumers in the last couple months, only 35% are aware of antibiotic use. But for 25%, it's a key factor. That means for those who are aware that antibiotics are used in farming fish and seafood, it's one of their major considerations in whether or not to choose fish and seafood. These are some very clear priorities, and I'm going to turn it back to RJ to look at what's on the mind of purchasing and menu decision makers as they decide whether or not to put fish and seafood on the menu or back on the menu and on the shelves.
So understanding that chefs and restaurant and restaurant operators have a significant opportunity to help drive not only volume, but also the amount of fish and seafood that American consumers are enjoying. It's important to understand what is important to this unique group of influencers. Can you go back one slide, Arlen? Thanks. So the fish and seafood industry would really like folks to understand what the term blue foods means. So we wanted to understand whether or not food service operators really knew the meaning of the term blue foods. And what we found is that when we polled this group of individuals, 65% of them had not heard of the term blue foods before. 28% of them had taken blue foods to mean purple or blue produce, foods that contain anthocyanins, and only 8% really understood that this category or labeling of foods meant foods from the ocean. And so we need to understand what's the best way to convey this type of messaging to food service operators, and is that messaging carrying all the way through to the end user? So when we look at the purchases that food service operators use to purchase different types of ingredients, we found that nearly half of food service operators purchase some type of fish or seafood weekly. This is definitely dwarfed by some other products. If we look at dairy, poultry, beef, etc., with fish and seafood really coming in at about mid-tier here. A third of operators would definitely purchase more fish and seafood if they knew that it has a smaller environmental footprint. So when it comes to food service operators, not only are they purchasing different types of ingredients to keep a variety on their menu, but they're also looking at what's their overall food cost of their menu, what's their menu mix look like, but also what's their PR strategy of their brand or of their business. We know that younger generations and the larger sections of generations of consumers that are dining at restaurants are definitely aware of a restaurant's environmental footprint and their impact on the environment overall. So we did find that about a little bit more than a third of operators would definitely purchase more fish and seafood if they knew that there was a smaller environmental footprint. In addition to that, we also learned that operators do plan to increase their purchase of poultry and plant-based alternatives and fish over the next 2 years. And that really had to come down to not only menu mix, but also looking at the nutritional mix of their menus and really understanding that consumers are clamoring for these types of choices over some of the heavier menu options of traditional animal-based protein items such as beef or pork. So the increase of plant-based food options, fish and poultry, is definitely increasing, but there's also that continued opportunity for fish and seafood to be elevated even more so than poultry. When we look at the top operator concerns for different types of animal proteins on their menu, which definitely impacts their purchasing choices, we notice that when it comes to meat and poultry, antibiotic use rose to the top, as well as the humane treatment of animals. When we look at what's important when purchasing fish and seafood, we did notice that value rose to the top. So food cost is definitely a concern when it comes to traditional fish and seafood and how that is perceived on their menu mix. Are they going to sell a larger amount of menu items containing fish and seafood, knowing that they're paying a higher dollar price to get that in through their back door? Also important that rose to the top was that environmental impact, along with the plastic contamination and impact on natural habitats that Arlen mentioned that was important to consumers as well. So you can see there is a discrepancy there when it comes to what's important to food service operators and putting fish and seafood on their menu versus consumers. There's a little overlap, but primarily what food service operators are concerned about is the overall perceived value and the environmental impact. Now, food service distributors are the best way to inform the choices of purchasing when it comes to those food service operators. They're the ones who are giving the chefs and the purchasing decision makers all of this information. So one of the things that is important is when you look at how distributors are impacting the menu impacting the menu decisions of chefs and operators. So they're looking at what are the company guidelines? They're also looking at is there a rating or a certification program when it comes to different types of fish and seafood programs, in addition to what are their distributors recommending or offering. Typically, when it comes to fish and seafood, chefs and operators are looking at A, what is sustainable, but also B, what is in season, what's available, and what also has a lower overall cost point. If something's out of season, that's going to raise the price point more. If something is not sustainable or may have a negative PR spin to it, then they will most likely not purchase that from their distributor. But they're really relying on their distributors to be able to give them that accurate information so they don't have to do all the added research on their end. So what are operators most operators are most influenced about when it comes to contamination and treatment. We're looking at mercury, industrial pollution, radiation. These are some of the environmental concerns that food service operators are taking into account when they're purchasing different types of fish and seafood. They know that this is important to their consumers as well, but also they want to make sure that they're doing right by by not only the fish and seafood industry, but also by the overall food service industry. Now, operators are also starting to consider the human rights in the supply chain, antibiotic uses, the sources and traceability, and this has all become more and more important as COVID has kind of surged. More important right now are human rights in the supply chain to food service operators, but just barely over the antibiotic uses that are used in fish and seafood production. And overall, COVID has had just a major impact on the food service industry. One of the things to note is that as labor becomes more and more of an issue in this particular industry, chefs and food service operators are going to look towards ways that they can reduce overall costs by looking at their menu mix and looking at what types of ingredients they are bringing in through their back door. They're also looking at simplifying their menus. One thing that we've noted is that they have simplified their menus by reducing their menu options by as much as 10% in most categories. And also they are starting to avoid things that may have some uncertainty. So items that have higher perishability, such as fish and seafood, are more likely to come off of menus than some of those mainstays that have a longer shelf life. And this all kind of ties into ways that we can communicate to food service operators and change that dynamic by suggesting different types of prepared fish and seafood products, whether that's cured fish and seafood, whether that's different types of canned fish and seafood. Maybe that's looking at ways that we can package fish and seafood differently to entice food service operators to purchase it and menu it more often. But all of these are great opportunities and key things for us to think about as we move forward with this discussion. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Arlen.
Thanks, RJ. I just want to take a minute before we segue into new messaging to just bring together what we've heard about consumers and purchasing decision makers who are also deciding about what goes on the menu. So again, we have this great opportunity to increase consumption, especially with a group of occasional eaters who are younger, mostly millennials and Gen Zers, more concerned about the environment, antibiotic use, what they ingest, and animal welfare, and also much more likely to want to eat fish and seafood in restaurants, and particularly not cook it for themselves, including finding other ways to get prepared fish and seafood like sushi into their homes without having to cook it. Unfortunately, the consequence of COVID on the restaurant industry, as RJ just said, is that restaurants are actually taking fish and seafood off the menu rather quickly. So we're at a bit of a fork in the road where we're poised for great growth, and the restaurant industry needs to change direction in some unprecedented times. When we look at the specific attitudes of consumers and purchasing decision makers, one other thing I want to point out is we've been working with purchasing decision makers for more than a decade. And in the past year and a half or two under COVID, this group of professionals has also experienced, significant dislocation. About half of them are new to their job, role, or company. A lot of people have left, been laid off, and rehired or changed companies. But in general, what we found is that consumers and purchasing decision makers have settled on what matters for meat and poultry: antibiotics, animal welfare, price, the use of chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides. But for fish and seafood, it's still in flux. There's not agreement except around microplastics, which is something that this community, the Conservation Alliance, has really helped put on the agenda. The other thing is consumers, especially millennials, who make up a large part of this occasional eater who wants to eat more, are much more likely to choose fish and seafood because it has a smaller environmental footprint than other protein choices. Purchasing decision makers are not as aware of that opportunity and are doing other things around sustainability and their brand. So there is an opportunity here to shift what menu and purchasing decision makers choose to do based on letting them know where consumers are headed, especially around fish and seafood. How we talk about that is part of the More If by C new messaging platform. And it's in two parts, which we'll talk about. One is for the general public and consumers, how you talk to the media, to your stakeholders, to your members, to people at large. And also what we say to the seafood industry, grocery retail, and restaurant food service partners who have actually a bigger platform and reach tens of millions of Americans each week through their advertising and through the people who walk through their doors to get food. So the More If by C messaging platform is available at changingtaste.net/more. We'll send an email out after this webinar, and you'll find more message content beyond what I'll share with you now, and also more details of the market analysis that RJ, Penelope, and I shared with you at a high level, along with the data-driven case for the use of each message. These messages are intended, again, in two parts. One is to get businesses to offer fish and seafood on the menu and in the store more often. And again, when we think about eating prepared fish and seafood, this also means in parts of the store beyond the fish counter, and also to adopt new messaging for how they advertise and talk to their customers. And then to get consumers, particularly the occasional eater who is a millennial or a Gen Zer, to eat fish and seafood one more time each week, and to act on their intention to replace meat with fish and seafood and not have pause or hesitancy. And with that, I just want to briefly share the messages with you. So messages for consumers, especially the occasional eater. Switching is simple. It's easy to order fish or seafood instead of something else in a restaurant. It's a great way to try something new. There's plenty of convenient selections in the grocery store. There's also affordable choices that are similar in price to fish and chicken. This is all reasons to make the switch you already want to make. Take control of your health and your future. Fish and seafood can boost your mood, your brain, and your immune system. These are all important health benefits beyond heart health or healthy fats that resonate with boomers. You're in charge of picking the best protein choice, and particularly eating more fish and seafood can help address climate change, something the Biden administration just trumpeted, and you'll find more research that we've done about this as well. Give fish a second chance. We love puns, and by this we mean eat it a second time a week, and also reconsider your beliefs and hesitations. For instance, we know mercury is a real concern that is causing people to not eat fish and seafood. But there's only about a half dozen kinds of fish and seafood, like swordfish, shark, and orange roughy, that have elevated levels of mercury. So you can just avoid those and try everything else. The ocean holds a delicious future. There's a lot of delicious choices for our health and the health of our planet, including eating in ways that lower our carbon footprint. We hear over and over again, as recently as yesterday's food industry news, that about half of younger consumers want to make food choices that will help address climate change. The ocean connects us. Food enables us to understand and share with other cultures. Food in general is one of the best ways we can learn, enjoy, and explore other cultures. Fish and seafood in the US is one of those globally traded foods that comes with all sorts of recipes, histories, and ways to learn about other places. And wake up to fish and seafood. When we think about increasing eating occasions, it's not just about dinner. Breakfast is one of the places where research found that younger people are most open to adding fish and seafood into their diet. And there's lots of other ways to cook fish and seafood. Here's a pollock spread that can add great protein and a great fish and seafood choice into a different eating occasion. With respect to messages for grocery retail and the restaurant food service business, these are a little more direct and, like the other messages, also very actionable. They tell you what to do, not just why to do it. Offer more kinds of seafood more often. There's robust market data that variety will motivate younger consumers to buy more often, and offering affordable choices can also drive sales. Value is a concern for both consumers and operators. Seafood is the right protein choice, healthy, better for the environment, and increasingly preferred for the consumers. Right now, purchasing decision makers are more inclined to add plant-based meat replacements where the consumers are losing interest in for the first two reasons. Seafood can help you achieve your sustainability goals and lower your environmental footprint. RJ talked about what does a restaurant operation or a retail brand mean, and everyone wants to address climate change. This is a practical way to change the mix to lower carbon footprint. Wake up to seafood and new flavors at breakfast. This is a specific parallel to what we say to consumers and a specific direction for where to add fish and seafood into the offerings of restaurant menus and also grocery stores, which are increasingly a source of ready-to-eat meals. And lastly, don't be scared of the water or water quality concerns. This is a big issue around food integrity. As RJ spoke, the food service industry and the grocery retail industry want to be responsible for their food choices overall. But we need to remember environmental and health benefits from eating fish and seafood are more significant than health risks. We also need to start recognizing leaders in the industry who are addressing the issues that are high priority to consumers. These include companies that are eliminating antibiotic use, going net zero in their wild capture fishing practices, reducing other chemicals. And again, mercury is a real concern also for people who are deciding what to put on the menu. Here, avoiding a handful of species and sources can make all the difference. And finally, and this is specific to grocery retailers in the food service industry, forced labor is an avoidable risk. The Conservation Alliance and others have done a great amount of work to help us understand where it exists in the world and where it doesn't. And it shouldn't stop you from expanding your seafood offering as long as you are aware of where you need to make your purchases from to avoid risk. There's lots more, again, at changingtaste.net, more message content, more data you can use to work with your grocery retail and food service partners, as well as your seafood suppliers and distributors in working with their customers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Penelope to moderate discussion.
Thank you so much, Arlen. So I guess if anybody has any questions, we can start addressing them.
And Laura, will people be able to unmute themselves or do they need to use the chat function?
Hi, yeah, folks, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourselves using that button at the bottom control panel toward the left to unmute yourself. So you should be able to go ahead and do that, but let me know if you're having any issues.
I don't know about any of you, but I am now so hungry for sushi.
Starving.
Every time we look at all these fish and seafood pictures, I just can't wait to start eating fish and seafood.
Agreed.
Definitely getting some agreement from the audience there. It looks like we've got a couple raised hands. Jack, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. I was wondering if you collected any data on domestic versus imported seafood preferences, or if there was a preference for local or anything along those lines that might connect geography and various fishery management considerations to what consumers are preferring. Thanks.
Thanks. So you asked several different questions there. So the first thing is that yes, for both purchasing decision makers and consumers, there is a preference to buy fish and seafood from American waters, but it's not a strongly held preference. One of the things we did, technically in the insights world, it's called a Q-sort, but we asked people what might be thought of as non-parallel questions. Instead of just saying, do you care if it's from, the US or perhaps from Mexico or Vietnam? We said, would you be more likely to buy this item if you knew it came from the US or you knew it was produced without antibiotics? So while the US preference is widespread, it is not as strong as some of the other factors we highlighted. The other thing we want to underscore is that we didn't get way down into the weeds around asking people about whether they cared if something was purse-seined or pollen-lined. But what we did find was the issues of food integrity, or what will go in my body if I eat this, including things that are present in the ocean that we know are not great or are pollution, were significantly more important than the impact of fishing on the marine environment in a couple of ways, like bycatch, overfishing, impact on coastal habitats. If you want to go to the website, and we'll be adding resources over the next about 10 days. By the middle of this month, you'll be able to see a presentation that specifically addresses the different environmental impacts and how much those influence someone's decision about whether to choose fish and seafood over another protein choice or not. That is, say, whether they'd eat it more often or not.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I know Tyler's got his hand up there if you want to go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Hi, Arlen. It's Tyler from Seafood Watch. Really interesting presentation, really exciting findings. I'm curious, at Seafood Watch, obviously, we've been scoped to providing information about seafood, and I've kind of long dreamed of a protein watch concept. I'm curious to know if you think it's worth our organization putting in any effort towards providing comparison type information with respect to some of these terrestrial proteins, and if so, which metrics? Keeping in mind, of course, we have such limited capacity and will remain scoped to seafood, but it's something I'm exploring, and I'd love to get your take on it.
Yeah. So in brief, yes, great idea. Let's talk more if you'd like. The comparison of the environmental footprint, especially around carbon, between fish and seafood and terrestrial proteins, is one of the keys to getting millennials and Gen Zers to eat fish and seafood more often. For a variety of reasons, the grocery retail industry doesn't want to talk about good and bad choices inside their store walls. And the restaurant industry is scrambled because of COVID and grabbing at plant-based alternatives instead. This is a powerful tool. Part of the analysis we'll share on the website is to look at the power of dietary change also in achieving meaningful environmental benefits. We mentioned briefly that the shift away from red meat, largely replacing it with chicken, and also reducing portion size, has already resulted in a 15% reduction in the carbon footprint of the US compared to a 2005 baseline. We modeled what would happen if we achieved this change over the next 5 years to get the occasional eaters to add one more meal a week. Here, the news is that we can get another 5% reduction in our nation's carbon footprint, which is really incredible if you think about, we can get 1/5 of our goals through changing menus, recipes, and what's on the shelf, compared to, say, retrofitting the energy industry or the transportation industry or rebuilding all of our homes or commercial buildings. It's really remarkable. There's a caveat there, though, and it really has to do with what Seafood Watch and really everyone else on the call is focused on. And that is that this benefit really comes if we also shift the mix away from air freighted farmed salmon and intensively farmed shrimp, which have really much larger carbon footprints than a lot of other choices. We also know that bottom trawling has a bigger carbon footprint. So making that mix efficient seafood one that's also sustainably produced is a key to getting that next 5%. And here, work from Seafood Watch or anyone else in the call will help, because the seafood industry includes leaders who are moving to be, much lower in carbon, lower in antibiotics, but also some old school thinking that it's wrong to admit any fault. So it's wrong to admit where we're trying to improve. And I think having an open discussion there will actually help accelerate the change in what we eat. So great question, Tyler. Thanks for giving me a chance to provide a long answer about why you are right on the mark about what to do.
Arlen, I'd like to chime
Arlen.
in there too, just real quick for Tyler. From a chef operator's perspective, I think that would be absolutely key for key purchasing decision makers. If I could look at one table, one graph, one chart, or maybe an alert that comes through on an app on my phone that says, hey, this particular type of fish or seafood is in the green. We already have that information, right? But how does that compare to other types of animal proteins, particularly commodity beef, commodity commercially raised chicken, et cetera? I think that would definitely not only influence the menu mix, but give operators something to think about as they plan their sustainability strategies and work with their marketing teams especially for large brands and those non-commercial food service operators as well. When we're talking about colleges and universities, healthcare, et cetera, a lot of that is a huge part of their marketing strategy. So I think that would be a huge benefit to the entire food industry.
And also empower the consumers. I think it would be fabulous. Go Seafood Watch.
Yeah, and thanks to you all. I'll put in the chat. We have something called Seafood Carbon Emissions Tool that we developed before COVID with Dalhousie University. I don't think we've done a particularly good job at marketing this, but then during COVID, we had to lose effectively the entirety of our outreach team. So we're working on rebuilding all of that, and may have some things in place that we can really bring to the forefront quickly. Yeah, thanks for your insight. Carbon is definitely a big thing on our radar.
Thank you. I can't see the group, Laura, so if somebody's raising their hands, I don't want to.
Yeah, no problem. Leanne, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for the always interesting presentation. I'm from Sea Choice, a sustainable seafood project in Canada, and there was recently a consumer perception study that came out looking at perceptions of salmon, including wild and farmed. And one of the really interesting things for us was that when asked if they would prefer ocean-based salmon or land-based salmon, so basically open net pen farmed salmon versus land-based closed containment salmon, the majority of consumers said they'd prefer ocean-based. salmon. So that was really interesting to us because it seems contrary to, concerns about antibiotic use, about environmental degradation, about a whole host of issues associated with open net pen salmon. So I was wondering if Changing Tastes have done any research into the marketing of land-based closed containment farm salmon and the messaging that will get consumers and major buyers excited about that farm salmon alternative.
So we are actually have looked at this over a couple years, and what we found is that there isn't much consumer understanding of the benefits that could come from land-based or recirculating systems. So, without taking us off on a different tangent, I would say, unless the survey specifically said that the land-based offering would be able to eliminate microplastics, assuming through water filtering, and avoid the use of any antibiotics or other chemicals, we don't think consumers have a basis for making a choice. They're not clear about what the benefits would be.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's kind of what we suspected as well. It might have been the choice of terms used by the people administering the survey.
Yeah, we did some work before COVID on this back in 2019. And, one of our takeaways, and the data was what we call, garbled for this reason. People really didn't know why they were choosing what they did, was that some people thought that putting things in the open ocean would get them away from having an impact on the coastline.
Yeah.
But there really wasn't an understanding of the different production systems. And we do want to say this, when we look at what changes consumers' behaviors and says, I will eat this instead of that, the mechanics of how fish and seafood is produced become complex. And so they choose to eat more chicken. At the same time, it's kind of a false choice, because it's unlikely they're going to walk into a grocery store and have, say, 6 kinds of fresh salmon in the case, labeled land-based recirculating, open ocean, wild caught, farmed in cold waters with less antibiotics, farmed in the Southern Hemisphere with more. They're really only going to look at one choice. So a lot of this information about better production methods is what the operators are hearing from their distributor partners. And then they are the gatekeepers on that 1 or 2 choices in front of consumers, who just hear all of this when they decide, is it the one choice I have for salmon, or is it another chicken breast?
I see. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Any other questions, Laura?
No, I think that's it, and right on schedule, as we're now 1 minute past the hour mark. So I'll hand it over to you to close this up. I just want to squeeze in a quick and genuine thank you to the whole Changing Taste team to being here with the Alliance today. I know I learned a ton. Sounds like others on the line did as well. So thank you for your time. And just a quick note to folks on the line that we will be circulating some materials along with the recording following the call in the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that.
Well, and thank you again, Laura. And it's been our pleasure. We look forward to hearing comments from any of you who want to get in touch with us on the website. And as Arlen said, all this information will be available for you online. So we hope everybody has a terrific day and stays healthy and eats lots of fish and seafood. Arlen, thank you. Arlen, thank you, RJ.
Of course.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.